Thank you everyone for coming along. My name's Mark. I'm the head buyer for United Cellars, and welcome to our first online wine tasting for New Zealand. If everyone's got their bottles ready, we're going to pop our champagne first. I'd like to also introduce Alistair Cooper, who you should see on your screen just there as well. Give us a wave, Ali. And Ali is joining us from the UK, from Henley, just outside of London. And I believe it's 7:30 your time there, Ali?
Yeah, the things I do for you guys in New Zealand and United Cellars. It is 7:32 in the morning, and safe to say, I think this is probably the earliest I've ever popped a bottle of champagne in my life. Then maybe in my misspent youth, perhaps I was still up at this time drinking a glass of champagne, but this is certainly the earliest. And this happened last week. I'm looking out onto the street with people walking their dogs, and they can see me with my wine. So it's great to be here with you guys in the morning.
Excellent. Good to have you, mate. Okay, so if everyone's ready and everyone's got a glass in front of them with some bubbles in it, we might get started on our little Tour de France. So let's go to our first screen here.
Are we going to be able to say?
Also, just before we start, if anyone's got any questions, don't forget to take yourself off mute. You're allowed to do that. I've allowed you to do that within the system. Alternatively, you can chat as well, and we'll be able to see the chats very, very easily. But any questions, just feel free to ask. We've got a lot to cover here tonight, and we're going to whip through it relatively quickly. So the wines of France. So France is obviously I'd say Ali about to pop the top on the champagne. Excellent. So
yeah, this is fun.
A few quick words about France. France is obviously one of the most diverse countries on the planet for winemaking, and a lot of people consider, myself included, France to be basically one of the, if not the center of winemaking in the world. So much of what we do here in Australia, but also New Zealand, is based a lot on what happens in France. In Australia, there's a little bit more of an Italian influence, but I'd say in New Zealand, it's very francophile. It's very French focused. If you think about Hawke's Bay Syrah, especially Central Otago Pinot Noir, which shares the same latitude as Burgundy. You think about areas like that. Martinborough has a big French influence as well. So there's a lot of influences that France has on the New Zealand winemaking industry. And we thought that tonight, to kick everything off here, we would take a tiny, tiny little snapshot of French wine. And we thought we'd go as diverse as we possibly could, go to the different corners of France to show you how diverse it can be and is. So here's a map of France. As you see, the vast majority of the regions within the states within France grow grapes and make wine. You see there are certain areas, of course, that we know very, very well: Burgundy, Bordeaux, Rhone Valley, Champagne, that are almost exclusively given over to the making of wine. And if you go through those regions, you'll see that if anyone has been to Burgundy or to Champagne, which is what we're trying now, the best example, you go through areas that are legitimately just field after field after field of vines on rolling hills. It is exclusively grapes and grapes for making wine. And there are very, very few regions in New Zealand and in Australia that are given over solely for the purpose of making wine. So it is, you can see why it's such an important part of French culture. Now, Ali, would you know off the top of your head, because I know it makes French wine making constitutes a huge percentage of their GDP. Would you know what that is?
Do you know, I'd be lying if I said I did off the top of my head. But to put into perspective the scale of winemaking in France, they have 850,000 hectares of land under vine dedicated to grapes, versus about 35,000 in New Zealand. So I mean, the Languedoc alone, where we're going to be going with the third wine with the red, produces over 10 times the amount of wine that is produced in the whole of New Zealand. You know, it's the world's biggest wine region. So when it comes to the GDP, I don't know, but it must be a huge percentage. And I think the other thing with the French, the French are so mercurial in many of the things they do, and I liken it to their rugby team, which I'm sure you guys over there will appreciate. When the French do things well, they do them so well. They're the creme de la creme. But a lot of the time, they do produce a lot of crap, dare I say it. So the French, for me, it is, as Mark said, the cradle of the wine industry. And when we talk about international grape varieties, they're not international at all. They're French. You know, the international grape varieties are found all over the world. Pinot Noir, Syrah, Cabernet, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, they're actually all French. They're not international. So it really is the home of France. As Mark was just saying, you go everywhere and it's just field after field after field. Wine is life. Wine and bread and cheese is France.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alan. So that's a very quick introduction to the wines of France. So we're going to start ourselves up in the north of France here, up in this region called Champagne. Just had someone else join us here. So just going to take us to our next slide. Now we've all got a bottle in front of us of Champagne AUTREAU. This is their Premier Cru Champagne. And this is one that United Cellars, we deal directly with the domain, with Laurent AUTREAU, and we buy the wines directly from his family cellars and we have them shipped across to us. So we have a very, very special, close relationship with this producer. Laurent and his sister are the sole. Laurent is the winemaker. He organizes the harvest. He does all of the blending. He does all the aging. He does everything. He's kind of a one-man band and is a very, very hard worker. And he makes what we consider to be one of the best handmade champagnes that we can get our hands on. We're very, very proud of it. So has everyone got a glass in front of them ready to go? And there are probably a few glasses already halfway done, I can see. Very good. So Champagne, let's get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of Champagne and what makes Champagne so unique. So this is a little map of Champagne. Now, one thing that I'll point out, which a lot of people don't really think of when they think of Champagne, Champagne is absolutely enormous. It is huge. And then the sheer number of bottles of Champagne that are produced every single year, it absolutely boggles the mind. It is incredible.
Do you know how much that is, Mark? Is it 300 and something million?
Last vintage, it was just under. It was 280 million. It's that was 2019. Harvest was 280 million bottles. So it's close to 300. In a really big year, it'll be over 300, but it's very close. So it is a phenomenal number of bottles of wine. That is much, much more than New Zealand would produce in any vintage, despite fantastic weather or no. So it's quite incredible. And the vast majority of Champagne that is made is actually consumed internally. It's consumed within France. Not a lot of it. A lot of it does, of course, get exported, but the lion's share is consumed within France. They do love their own product. So, and I mean, you would if you had that, you would. So, where we are, we're in. I'll just go back to the image again here. So, AUTREAU lies within the Montagnes d'Avance, which is in the centre here. Now, Laurent is based in Epinay, and his cellars are based in Epinay, but his vineyards are in the Montagnes d'Avance. Now, what makes Champagne so unique? Let's go to this next page here. Just going to move some things around. I'm just going to move all our faces away here. So the traditional method of sparkling wine is what defines Champagne. There are many theories as to the history of this, and a lot of them are kind of glorified and made up potentially. One theory is that Dom Perignon, who was a monk, he was the one who accidentally created the.
No. Now here, no. I'm
Here's
not
where
having
the
any.
controversy starts.
I'm not having any of that because champagne, sparkling wine, was actually invented in the Cotswolds in England. And this is interesting because everyone talks about it being Dom Perignon, the monk, Moet Chandon, Codswallop. It wasn't. It was actually, they were doing it for many years before in the UK, and it was documented in 1662 by Christopher Merritt, that great naturalist and all sorts of other things in the UK. And he was documenting that in the UK, it was happening before that. So I'm not having any of that. Champagne is actually an English invention, and we'll leave it at that. They can try and claim it, but it's English.
Either way, thank you, Alec. Either way.
Well, actually, to be fair, like most things, the English invent them, and then other people sort of perfect them. New Zealand with rugby, and the French with sparkling wine.
Cricket? Any chance? Cricket? Or
no. Let's move on to the sparkling wine. Thank you.
So that's a very good call. So in Champagne was where they really mastered the art of it. And there were a lot of pieces that came together that allowed this process to become. Someone's asked, can we get a vote on who believes Ali? Who wants it to be England or France? Who do we believe?
I think I know what the answer is going to be here. We're dealing with New Zealand. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I know where this is going.
That's a good question. So a lot of things did come together in Champagne, in that region, in order to make this the enormous and successful industry that it is today. And Ali, whilst they might have invented it there, I doubt there would have been the same market or industry had it continued to stay there. When the Romans came to that region, this is many millennia ago, they carved out chalk cellars. They took large chunks of chalk, and if you ever get the opportunity to go to Champagne and you go into the cellars underground, you can literally see the hand-hewn, the chisel marks in the rock, where they've taken away enormous chunks of limestone. Now, these cellars are absolutely perfect for maturing wine, and specifically maturing this wine, Champagne. So what happens is, you see in this image that I've put up here, so you've got you make a wine as you would any other still wine in the world. You then add a small mixture of, you ferment that to dryness. You then add a small mixture of yeast in a very strong bottle, and then you age it. That aging period is incredibly important. In those sealed bottles for a period of many, many months, actually considerably more than a year, the yeast within that bottle starts a secondary fermentation, which creates carbon dioxide as one of the byproducts. That then gets taken into the liquid, and the only time it's then released is when you pop the bottle. So that's where you get the bubbles. But there's a lot of things that need to go right in this process. And the Champenois were the ones that really perfected this, in my belief. And today you can see, I mean, the price of champagne is very, very rarely achieved by anyone else. There's basically every country in the world worth its salt with winemaking will make a sparkling wine that tries to be New Zealand or is imitating it in a certain way. I know Cloudy Bay down in Marlborough do a traditional method sparkling wine. In Australia, Arras down in Tasmania do a similar thing. And they definitely are all aiming for champagne as the absolute pinnacle point. However, I stand by the statement that I don't think anyone ever actually gets close.
Well, yeah. I'm going to stop you there again, because guess what? I've got a theory that perhaps actually, and this is, joking aside, with climate change and things are warming up, England, how we're not tasting English sparkling wine, but England actually with the same soil types is one of those that's producing some world-class wines. But we're actually a long way behind. I think there's certain examples of English wine that come close to Champagne, but we're a long way behind because they've had, centuries of expertise. But the key thing that they have in France that's important with Champagne is that is this brand idea. It's quite different to the rest of the winemaking world, where each wine is an expression of the vintage. And actually, with champagne, nearly everything that we drink is the non-vintage style. And the production methods that Mark's shown quite here, how you make the wine sparkling, is incredible. But to create champagnes are all about brand, and they want your bottle of AUTREAU, they want your bottle of Moët, whatever it is, to taste the same year in, year out. And to do that, they're blending wine across many different vintages. Often, to make some of these non-vintage wines, they'll be blending parcels of over 100 different wines before they're even made. So before, in this stage here, before the tirage goes in, so they finish their first fermentation, then they're all blended with different parcels of wine to try and create this same end product. And that is an incredibly impressive skill that these blenders have, to be able to taste a raw product and see how it's going to turn out year after year. So it's quite a different, one of the main reasons that they did that actually was because of climate, because each year, because it's such a marginal climate, being very cool in Champagne, they would have years where actually they weren't making much wine. So to get over that, they would keep reserve wines in stock and blend it to get over the fact that it was so marginal, and they would lose many vintages of wine. So it's an incredibly technical process, much more than any other wine style, I think, because actually the wines themselves from Champagne, the still wines, are just highly acidic wines. So they need this secondary process to give them depth and to give them what we have here in the glass, which I think, I've just smelled this. It tastes amazing. Have you guys all tasted it yet? Anyone?
Yep, a few cheerses there. Very good.
Anyone got any comments or thoughts or questions on this wine, or want to give a tasting note?
Well, okay.
Want to write it down?
All right. My tasting notes, because I didn't really look at the list next to it, but I thought it had a strong hint of raisin to start with, sort of raisin or fig, and then it sort of has a almost marmalade-y bitterness, and then as it builds up, it's a little bit sort of the hint of fruit cake about it, strangely enough, for me.
So definitely more on the fruit spectrum of things. Yeah, interesting. So
I'd agree with that, actually, and I think it's interesting, the blend of this. We haven't talked about the blend. This, I believe, I did write it down. Was it 80%? No, 40% Pinot Noir, 40% Pinot Meunier, and 20% Chardonnay. And the three grapes in Champagne, obviously, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay gives backbone, Pinot Noir gives body, and Pinot Meunier gives that really fruity vibrancy. And I think on this, that 40% of Pinot Meunier, you're right, really gives that vibrancy of fruit, and you can get that coming through.
Yeah, we're tasting it here in the office in New Zealand, and a lot of the guys are saying that Granny Smith apple flavour coming through, that nice fruitiness. Just wanted to quickly, Ali or Mark, while you're there, if you could touch on the difference between Premier Cru and Grand Cru, because we also have a Grand Cru version of the AUTREAU available.
Sure, yeah, I'll do that. So France is really complex in what you see as a Grand Cru or Premier Cru in Burgundy. They have a different system in Bordeaux, the Cru Classé system, and here in Champagne as well, they have a different system just to make it wonderfully complex, as the French.
It's very easy to learn, yes.
It's very easy to learn. So the difference between Grand Cru and Premier Cru and a nothing in Champagne is essentially they set up a system called the Échelle, which sets the price of grapes. And there are 17 Grand Cru villages in Champagne. And then, to be honest, I don't know how many Premier Cru there are. And at the beginning of the year or beginning of the harvest, the price of grapes are set. And any grower in a Grand Cru village, of one of those 17 Grand Cru villages, will get 100% of that price for the kilo of grapes, be it, I don't know what it is. Let's say it's $2. It will be a lot more, but they get $2. And then Premier Cru vineyards will get anything between 90% and 99%. Each village is graded differently. And then the others that are neither Premier Cru or Grand Cru will be getting the lowest is 80%. So realistically, it's only a 20 sort of percent scale. So it's all to do actually on the villagers that have been given this thing. So it's all set on price and a village rather than in Burgundy, a Grand Cru is a particular vineyard. Here, it's a whole village.
Interesting. Now, Anthony's just asked a question here online. Now, this is a very, very interesting question. How does that compare with other sparkling regions in reference to Grand Cru? So, especially English. Now, that's an interesting question. Do you guys in England, because I know the sparkling wine is gaining ground, and in all honesty, when I was in London with you, Ali, when we were sitting some blind tastings, someone gave me a sparkling English wine as a blind tasting, and I thought it was champagne. It was very impressive, mainly because of the acidity in it. But so, is there a classification system in England so far?
No, there's nothing yet, and there's a lot of talk about people wanting to introduce that, and there's producers. There's quite a big debate here. Some people want to protect the region of Sussex. Some people want to have regional Kent, but a lot of people are actually blending grapes from Kent and Sussex. In short, no, there isn't. And actually, I think that gives us some kind of advantage at the moment to not have that much. There's so much bureaucracy in France that actually I don't think we need it yet. I think that will come into play, but I don't think we have a strong enough sense of terroir yet to introduce a system. So no, there isn't.
Yeah, and I think history definitely plays a big part in that. I think given a little bit more history, a little bit more experience, I think there will be. It's almost inevitable. You guys selling something within the EU will definitely have to have something. But Anthony, to answer your question, in a more in other countries as well. So within Australia and New Zealand, within the majority of the New World, there is no real classification system outside of the usage of the term traditional method. Traditional method denotes this method that I have on the screen in front of you here, the sparkling wine traditional method. That is the only thing, and that usually denotes a wine that is of higher quality, that takes a lot more time to produce, and also costs a lot more money to produce. Outside of the New World, within the higher quality regions of, say, Italy, so Franciacorta is the highest quality sparkling wine producing region in Italy. That is a DOCG, so that is a top level region of production. Within where we go, Spain would be Cava. That is a DOC, so that will be the highest quality level. Within that, Ali, do you know if there are sub-classifications within there? I'm not sure there are.
You know, Cava's a really complex one, and actually the Cava can be produced pretty much all over Spain. So the heartland of Cava is actually around Penedès, so around Barcelona. But interestingly enough, a good friend of mine just sent me his Master of Wine research paper, which is on changes within Cava. So I just read it a few days ago, and there's a lot of people, a lot of producers in Cava who are very unhappy with the DO system, because it essentially it can be produced all over the country, and they want it to be more delimited. So it's something that's really in flux at the moment, and Cava's really suffered. I think everyone's drinking Prosecco, and I think the image of Cava, certainly in the UK, has always been quite stuffy, and I think they do need to renovate their thing. So it's a complex one in Spain.
Okay, so we might keep moving. I'm just cognizant of the time we have here. So just here, I've just put a few little words on the traditional method, which ties precisely back to what I was just talking about before. So you'll see in this first paragraph here, there are several words for it. One other thing that I will mention here is méthode cap classique, which is a South African term for traditional method, which goes back a long, long way. That's another quality designation of a New World sparkling wine, but that is exceedingly rare, very, very hard to come across. However, it does denote certain things within production. So 5 to 7 atmospheres, which is 7 atmospheres, I believe, is the pressure within a car tire. So it is pretty high. It's pretty high. So it's in 2015, it was awarded champagne. The traditional method was awarded UNESCO heritage. So it's completely protected, and Champagne as a region was protected in 1994, I believe it was called. That was when everyone in the world could call things Champagne. And in 1994, that region of Champagne was designated as the only place that could call it that. So we have probably had a glass or two of champagne now, so we may move on to our rosé.
Just a quick question.
Is there any more questions?
Yeah, any other questions, sorry?
Just a quick one before we move on. You touched on the fact that it's family owned and operated, which is great. We love working with those more independent winemakers. If you want to, could you just touch on what's the difference between growers champagne and, like, you know, it's not AUTREAU is not a champagne that we see in liquor stores and supermarkets in New Zealand. So some of the differences there.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer
Yeah,
that
absolutely,
one?
mate. Go for it.
And there's an interesting, if you look on the back of each bottle of champagne, so if you grab your bottle of Champagne AUTREAU, somewhere on here it will have two letters that tells us quite a lot. Yeah, so at the bottom of the label, on the front label, certainly this one I have here in the UK, it says made by, élaboré par, blah, blah, blah. And then at the bottom, it has these two letters NM. And you will find on every bottle of champagne, there's several things. You'll find NM or RM is the most common other one. NM means négociant manipulateur, which means that they buy, Champagne AUTREAU have their own vineyards. They have about 30 hectares, but they also buy a lot of their grapes from elsewhere. So it means that they're a négociant, which means they're also buying grapes. If you find on the bottle it says RM, it means récoltant manipulateur, which means that they are a grower champagne. They only use their own grapes to make their wine. And actually, that's a really important thing because there's over 19,000 growers in Champagne. The average parcel that a grower that owns land has is about 2 hectares. So most people, because of the high cost that we saw of making champagne, most growers will sell their grapes to the likes of AUTREAU or to the likes of, you know, the big brands, Moët, Lanson, Veuve Clicquot. They will buy huge quantities of grapes. It's not coming normally from their own land. They'll have small parcels, but they're essentially a big cooperative that buy the grapes and create these brands. Grower champagnes produce them in very small quantities because, as we said, they may have 1.5 hectares, 2 hectares, and they only grow their own grapes and make their own wine. So they're really quite fashionable now, these grower champagnes, because obviously they're made by one person who tends the grapes, etc., and they're not sent off elsewhere. So there are an increasing number of people now who are making their own champagnes. But it's quite an interesting, and as we say, Champagne is really very different to the rest of France in its creating brands and in the amount of grapes that are sold to the big companies. So that, I hope that answers that question.
Very good. So
Cool.
Now we're going to move on to a region. So what we tried to point out here with this tasting is we wanted to go to regions that have kind of set the standard across the world for being the region that people think of when they think of a wine style. So first of all, we think of sparkling wine. The best example of that would be Champagne. So we start with there. Next, we go to Provence, to a rosé. Now, a lot of people, when you think of rosé, the true heart of rosé is in the south of France, and Provence would be the centre of that. So this is from our good mate Bruno down in Provence. In what's the sub-region then? Is it Maure?
Yeah, in Maure, MAOU. That what we've got written.
What's on the show? Yeah. So Bruno is a lovely
question.
man. Yeah, mate.
I've actually got a question for everyone in New Zealand. So the rise of rosé, I know globally, has been huge. It's been absolutely incredible over the past decade how pink has become fashionable again when it was really unfashionable. Here in the UK, I know in Australia, I imagine it's the same in New Zealand. Is that the case? Have you guys seen a huge amount of people, it's now acceptable for men to drink rosé, whereas it wasn't before. Is it the same in New Zealand? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes.
Yes, it is. Is it?
Yep. Yes. A summer drink.
Okay.
Definitely.
I think our rosés are white and red blends, aren't they, rather than being the sort of early extraction of the grape.
Ooh, I think, well, actually, interesting point. The only place in the world where you can blend red and white wine together to make rosé is in Champagne.
Yeah, we've just come from there.
It's actually where we've just been. I think there are some unscrupulous producers mixing red and white to create rosé, but legally, as far as I'm aware, the only region is Champagne where they will pour in a little bit of their Pinot Noir into the blend to make it. Normally, it's just the early extraction of rosé, and that's, I think, as we're going on to Provence, and we're probably going to talk about this in a second, Mark, is the method of production in Provence is what really sets it apart, and I guess we're going to touch on that in a second.
So Gary's just said, correct, there's lots of rosé here in his place, and Joe said, yep, fashionable for drinking in the sun, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So,
and it does have a magical thing. It puts a smile on your face, rosé, doesn't it? It really can transport you to a place, and this is a wine that just takes you to the south of France, and we'll talk about that in a second.
So let's go there. So Provence the south of France is the south of France in general, the Languedoc, the larger region I think it is the most productive region in the world, I think. Is that
for
rosé? Or for wine in general, I know it is. It's basically just a factory for wine down there.
No, it's actually the Languedoc, which we'll be going to next. Yeah, but they're next door to each other. Yes. Provence is a little bit smaller, but yeah, Provence is a large region.
And Provence does produce more rosé than anywhere else in the world. Rosé was, funnily enough, rosé is actually one of the. We go back to Champagne. That has a history that goes back, as Ali said, back to the 17th century. So it goes back quite a fair way. However, rosé as a wine that we see it as now, which is a lightly pressed red, was initially from the region of Tavel, which is in the southern Rhone Valley, just on the Rhone River. And that it only goes back a couple of hundred years. It was very famous in that region, but in not too many other regions at all. People kind of looked at it and thought, well, is it red or is it white? What are we thinking here? So the Provence region and the southern Rhone region have always been home to rosé. And when you think about Provence, you think about that area in the south of France, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Drinking crisp, fresh, slightly herbal, little touch of sweetness in there, a dry rosé makes perfect sense for sitting in the sun in Saint-Tropez, sitting by the on the Côte d'Azur. So
it also just goes really well with the food down there. I'm lucky to go down there every year. My parents have a house down there, and it just goes so well with not many wines actually go well with garlic, and this goes incredibly well with garlic dishes, and the French love their garlic. Goes well with bouillabaisse, with fish soup, with ratatouille. It's just really does speak of the place. It goes very well with strawberries as well. And with the local fruit, with melon, it really just fits. And I think actually one of the reasons that rosé has become so, especially Provence rosé, as you were just saying, is it's a very aspirational drink. It takes you down to the beaches of Saint-Tropez, to the clubs of Saint-Tropez, to the yachts, to Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie have bought a chateau down there and were important in pushing it. It's a very aspirational drink because of this beautiful colour and because of it just evokes a glamorous lifestyle.
Now, we've got a question from Sky here. So how is Provence rosé different to Pinot rosé that we drink in New Zealand? So that's a great point. So that is the vast majority of rosé that we drink in New Zealand is Pinot rosé, because Pinot Noir is a huge part of the New Zealand wine industry. There are a lot of regions where Pinot grows very, very well. And the thing to remember is that Pinot is a very fickle variety, and it doesn't grow everywhere, and it's not very. It's popular in a lot of places, but it doesn't grow everywhere. So, Pinot Rosé is honestly quite hard to come by anywhere else in the world. We're very lucky in New Zealand to have access to so much Pinot Rosé. But Ali, do you want to kind of hazard a guess as to what you would think would be the differences here between Provence Rosé and Pinot Rosé?
In stylistically, or probably in the way they're potentially in the way they're made. And I don't know, speaking for New Zealand, one of the key things about rosé, and you're about to get, what's serious rosé? Serious rosé is actually rosé that's been made from grapes that have been grown specifically to create rosé. So 90% of the wine coming from Provence is rosé, and down there at the beginning of the harvest or the beginning of the year, they know that they're going to make rosé from those grapes. But that might sound strange, but actually often rosé can be a byproduct of making a red wine. So let's say in New Zealand, I'm not sure how it is, but there may be quite a lot of producers who are making a Pinot Noir, and they think, well, actually, we'll also make a rosé. And what they do is they make it as a red wine, and as it gets to a certain bit of the extraction process, they will take some of the juice off and make a rosé, and then continue to make a red wine. So what happens is that red wine will be stronger and a little bit fruity and a little bit bigger, and they can also make a rosé. But the difference is their aim is to make a good Pinot Noir and not to make a rosé. Whereas in Provence, their aim is to just make a rosé. They're not thinking about making a red wine, which means it's the forefront of their mind to make a serious rosé. So I think that's the main difference. But also from a sensory thing, I think the grapes down here, they give much more lightly scented. I think the Pinots from New Zealand, the Pinot Rosés, will be a bit fruitier and a bit bigger, more generous in their fruit. I think there was another question I just saw come up. Is there a classification in Provence for rosé? Good question. Yes, there is, but it's very antiquated, as with Bordeaux. So there are, I believe, 23.
Very good, Ali. 23. Very good.
Well, someone's going to look it up and say I'm wrong. I believe there were 23 crude producers, Sam Marguerite, Minuti, there are a whole load of them. 5 of them are now not producing wine anymore, so I think there's only 18 left. But it means nothing. It was just chateaus that were producing the best rosé wine probably 200 years ago, maybe 100, maybe 150 years ago, and they're never going to redo the system. These chateaus are just lucky to have it, but it doesn't actually mean a great deal. So there is, but I wouldn't pay any attention to it.
Yeah, a lot the guys that exist within the old chateau regions are they'll play on it. They'll say that they that they live and die by it because it suits what they're doing. However, absolutely. Yeah, I mean you'll see that, as Ali mentioned, I think you're right in that it's around about 5 of these regions are now defunct. Several of them have been either turned into resorts or they were on the outskirts of a town at the time, and the towns have grown and grown and grown as they've become more popular, and these regions have basically just been taken over by the city that exists around that area now. So it's not necessarily it's not a qualification of quality, no. But it's more like it was based around the Bordeaux system of the classification system in 1855 in Bordeaux, where there were houses and chateaus and estates that were of high quality, and they were given a rating, and they tried to do a similar thing in Provence, but it's definitely not stuck as well as the Bordelais one has, that's for sure.
No. I've just seen we've got another question from James. What was it about this particular rosé that made you bring it to New Zealand? Very good question, and actually you can blame my parents for that.
It's true, we can.
So I don't know if we go on to the next slide, but actually, so I'm lucky enough, as I said, my parents own a house in a town called Port Grimaud. Oh no, we haven't got a slide of it. I think we'll go back. I thought we had a picture of Bruno, and we go there every year. And about 8 years ago, my dad said, "Oh, Ali, I found this new." We were driving up from Saint-Tropez somewhere, and we saw a sign for a winery, and they often do this. They'll pop in, and they said, "We found this really great one called Val d'Astier." And so I went over, and then he gave me a couple of bottles of wine, and I tasted it, and I thought, this really is good. So every year I would go up there and see Bruno, the charismatic winemaker. And I hope we had a picture of him, because he looks a bit like Gru from Despicable Me, if you've ever seen that character. He's a wonderful character. He grew up in Burgundy and now makes these beautiful rosés down there. And when I started working with United, they said, we're looking for some rosé from Provence. And I said, well, let's go and see Bruno. He only has about 12 hectares. He doesn't export much at all. He's very into, he and his wife, it's a whole family affair. He and his wife, Ellen, I think she's called, run it. They have sheep on the land. They produce honey. She used to grow vegetables and sell them to all the local Michelin star restaurants. And they produce different cuvées of wine. And this is the one of the ones that they're called. It's from, as Mark was saying, Mourvèdre is the hills around where they are. So the area they're in is called Mourvèdre. And one more, he said, this is my swimming pool wine. This is what I want people to finish the bottle and always want one more. So that's kind of his play on words of the region and what this wine is. And I think he's done it really well. I mean, we popped in to see him, didn't we, when we were doing our tour last year. And they're charismatic, lovely people, and just producing these wines at great prices for me. This just transports me. Every time I have a sip of this, it just takes me to our home in France and makes me smile.
Absolutely, he's a fantastic person, and he also he's got a very, very interesting story as well that ties into why he's such a hard worker and why he's the kind of man that he is now. He's originally from the Caribbean. Was it Cuba originally, or was it?
It's probably Martinique, wasn't it?
Martinique, it was. It was Martinique. You're right. So he's originally from Martinique, and he was a very good football player when he was younger, and he was asked to play football in France, and then moved to France, played for one of the second division football teams in the north there, and then fell in love with France and fell in love with a woman and decided to stay, and then thought, and he came from a very, very, very poor background and in Martinique, and his parents were farmers, so it was kind of all he really knew. But he thought to himself, why not make wine? He and his wife moved to Provence, to an area that was more similar in climate to what he was used to from Martinique, and then decided to make wine. So he kind of taught himself everything from the beginning, and he's making some absolutely gorgeous wines with and he's now roped his son into helping him now, who's becoming a very, very good winemaker in his own right, which is fantastic. Yeah.
And again, I was just going to jump in about New Zealand Pinot Rosé versus Provence Rosé. How you said he likes it. It's a swimming pool drink. It's a drink that you can just keep sipping on in the sun. And Provence Rosés tend to be quite a lot drier and more focused on that minerality. You pair it with food. It doesn't have the kind of fruit sweetness that we're kind of used to in New Zealand. And it tends to be definitely, like you said, it transports you to that nice, sunny, the area of France where you have summer holidays kind of deal. So.
That sounds about right. Yeah, I think it's just, as you say, a little bit more serious. And yeah, no, that's good to hear. So we haven't talked about the grape varieties, have we?
So yeah, this is a little quiz here, of which there is no prize, unfortunately, but it just goes to show you that Provence is quite an interesting area when it comes to grape varieties. As we mentioned before, you guys said, what was the Pinot Rosé that you're so used to? It's much, much more common in New Zealand, and it is also in Australia as well, and many countries, to have one grape variety as your rosé grape variety. In Australia, it's Grenache. It tends to lean more towards Grenache. New Zealand, it's Pinot Noir, absolutely. In Provence, there's a big mix of wines. So throw out some names here. See if you can name any of the ones here. as I said, there are 20, several of which are white, so that are allowed. So any thoughts that anyone's got? Pinot Noir is definitely not in there. I'll give you a hint there.
I know. Yes.
I've mentioned one already from
one of our newer guys in the office has jumped in and wants to contribute what he remembers.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, well, so yeah, I'm fairly new. So it's Grenache Cinsault, Ugni
Blanc.
Oh, Ugni Blanc, and is it Syrah as well, or am I just being para?
No, that's very good, very good. Gary said Chardonnay. That's unfortunate. I don't think Chardonnay is allowed in it. No.
No, but yeah, no. There's some Ugni Blanc. Yeah, probably. Yeah, Ugni Blanc will be.
Is allowed. Yes, it's only small amounts.
But the other ones, absolutely.
So let's just have a look, because there are some that are definitely more useful in the rosé blend, and some that are less so. So obviously the main ones are what we would call the Mourvèdre Grenache Cinsault. So very good for those of you that got it there. Just checking here. And then less common, they're allowed to have Cabernet, Syrah, Carignan. Carignan used to be really, really popular. Less so now. It used to be very popular because it had enormously high yields, and you could produce, and it was quite a very, very lightly coloured grape variety already, so you didn't have to do much work to make it a rosé. So that tend to be several of the cheaper wines that would use that. Braquettes, Calitor, Folle, Tiburon, Bourboulon, Claret, Grenache Blanc, Marsanne, Viognier, because you're in the Rhone Valley, of course.
Chardonnay's in there.
Chardonnay's in there. Right. There we go. Very good.
Gary was right.
Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, Rollet, and Ugni Blanc. So,
do you know, but interestingly enough now, so they're all, the Roll is a white grape variety, also goes by the name of Vermentino.
Yes. Which
some of you may have heard of. And actually, Roll is growing in importance down there. And actually, I think, yes, this actually has a little bit of Roll in there.
Yes.
So, yeah, Roll has increased in importance down there. And I think actually Syrah, this is a blend of Syrah Grenache Cinsault, and Roll. And I think the key thing about why these grape varieties, and if we look at Cinsault, Syrah, Grenache, Mourvèdre, Carignan, probably less so Cabernet, these are grape varieties that do well in warm climates. It's warm down there. You know, it's the south of France, it's hot. Climate is important. The proximity to the coast is important there, so that has a large influence in cooling the grapes. If it wasn't there, it would be very, very hot, a bit more like the Rhone Valley. And you also have this very intense wind that we experienced in the Rhone, Mark, when we were there, when we went for a run, and we couldn't
in the morning.
I think you went home. I soldiered on, but called the Mistral wind, which comes from the north. And that's very important as well in cooling the vines down, because it's good for the health of the vines, so it dries out any fungus or rot that they may have. But these are all grape varieties that are drought resistant, not drought resistant, but are heat tolerant. And all of these grapes. So that's a really important point. That's why you won't find Pinot Noir much down there, because as Mark said earlier, it's a fickle, difficult grape variety. And it doesn't deal so much with the heat, hence why it does well in New Zealand, where it's a little bit cooler. So it really, that's why these grape varieties work very well down there.
Yeah. So we touched on Grenache Cinsault and things like that. Now we're going to touch on Syrah. So we're going to move on to our next one here.
Well, what does anyone, just before we finish, should we move on? Does anyone have any comments? Do they like this wine? What are their thoughts? For me, it just transports me to the south of France, and I want to be sitting by the beach rather than locked down in my house in England. Any thoughts? Becky loves it. That's good. It's dangerously drinkable. That's exactly it. And that is what Bruno had in mind when he called it One More. And it really is, you know, even at 8:20 in the morning, I'm enjoying drinking this one. It really is very easy to drink.
That's perfect rosé time, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
8:30, 8:20 in the morning. Yeah, again, I've just, lady walking her dog just looked up at me with very strange.
Never been so good looking.
Why, thank you, Anthony. Any other thoughts? I mean, I think we've touched on how this compares to Pinot Rosé, and I must say New Zealand must be the only place in the world where Pinot Rosé is prevalent, because it is normally such an expensive, tricky grape. I had one the other day from Australia, from Bird in Hand, which was in Adelaide Hills, which was beautiful. But would you agree with me that, and as everyone said, this is just a little bit more refined, dare I say it, and less fruit driven? Anyone?
A couple of nods there, yeah.
A couple of nods. Nods are good.
Yeah, for me, the main difference would be, I get in this one a lot more of that. The term you use is garrigue, which is that slightly herbal touch to the wine. That little bit of lavender and garrigue herbs that are very, very common to the region. So
yeah, I think you're right. And for me, I always get a sort of honeydew melon character as well. And when I opened this, I'm actually lucky. I've got the new vintage here because I spoke to Bruno and said, "Can you send me a bottle over?" And you guys in New Zealand have drunk all of the current vintage, so he's got none left. So he sent me a bottle of the new vintage, and I've got to say, you guys are in for a real treat when this lands, because it's got the big thumbs up to come over. It's tasting absolutely gorgeous. It was a great vintage 2019, so this is a really recently bottled. It's got honeydew melon, it's got fresh strawberry, it's got that hint of garrigue thing that Mark was talking about, which is essentially a rosemary sort of scrubby herbal character. And this, as I'm not trying to get one-upmanship, your vintage is beautiful. You wait till this one lands. You're going to want to buy a load of this one. It's gorgeous, really, really gorgeous. And for the price, because Provence Rosé, with this rise of fashion, it's become quite expensive, and this is still really affordable.
When is that new vintage in? The new vintage available?
We need to ship it, don't we?
Next time we order, it'll be 19 vintage.
Next time we order, we'll get it in, and because this was only just bottled, and I'm sort of the first person to see it, really. So it's looking hot.
Beautiful. All right. If there's no more questions, we're just going to move on to our final wine in France. And now we're gonna stay in the south, in the nice, sunny, warm south, and we're going to go to the Pays d'Oc, the Languedoc. So this is Levasseur. So this is a wine brand that we've worked with for many, many, many years, and it is legitimately our most successful wine, imported wine in the history of our entire company. Every time we get this in, it is just absolutely just so very popular. And that is we've had some arrive in Australia literally yesterday. And someone who was new to our business, one of my team, they said, "What is it with this Levasseur? Why are people so interested in it?" And it's because it ticks basically every one of the boxes. It's well priced. It's got lovely label, looks quite modern. They've done a screw cap for us, which is perfect. And it shows good. It's south of France, and it just shows good varietal character for a very good price. It just ticks every single box for us. And these guys, Levasseur, they make some beautiful wines year on year on year. Very, very reliable.
And how much does this sell for I know the UK price, how much does it sell for in New Zealand and Australia?
$24.99, or you can go elsewhere and be $38.
Yeah, $24.99 in Australia and New Zealand, same price.
Boom, that's a bargain.
Yeah,
very, very, very good value.
So just quickly, this is the Languedoc. This is a map of the Languedoc. Now this is, as I was saying before, this is one of the largest production regions on Earth, really.
It's the largest, yeah.
It is the largest. Sorry, it is the largest. It is just a factory of producing wine, and it can be. You can get some absolutely incredible wines from around here. There's some beautiful in Minervois, in Corbière, Fitou. You can get some absolutely incredible wines, but there are some you can get some real bog standard, just no oak, no complexity, just pay doc, just get it out there. So this we find we've had to search far and wide to find someone who could produce prodigious amounts of high quality wine for us, and that's what these guys at Le Verson make for us. So they source from all across the Languedoc. They're a large cooperative producer, and depending on the vintage, they pick and choose which one looks best for them. So sometimes we'll get a lower allocation of Syrah and we, you know, or Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, or whatever it is. So, but yeah, this is a larger picture of the Languedoc, the largest production region in the world. It's very.
I think they worked. If I'm not, they work with around 1,200 producers, don't they?
Yeah, they work with a huge number of producers. And if you think about the sheer the difference in quality, the difference in grape varieties, the difference, because you can see on the left side of this here, you can see that again there's an incredible number of grape varieties that they are allowed to put in their wines. So therefore, it's yeah.
Okay, we've got a question from James coming in. How was 2018 as a vintage? Would you recommend cellar time, or is it best to get it in the glass? 2018 as a vintage in France was exceptionally warm, especially down in the south. I remember I was down in our house in Provence for most of the summer. It was very, very, very warm. But you know, what is important down here, as I talked about, is the influence of the proximity to the coast, and that really plays such a vital role down here of retaining that acidity. It cools the vines at night, and this is certainly a wine to be drunk. It's not going to it's not going to improve in the cellar. It will improve with a little bit of air. Whack it in your decanter. But this is a wine to be drunk and enjoyed. Get it in the glass, open it up. It's fruit driven. It's not going to improve massively. As I say, if you leave it in your cellar for 2 to 3 years, it will hold, but it's not going to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the style of wine that we want, really, from these guys for that price point. So just a few little bits in here. So I'd be very keen to hear your feedback here, because obviously New Zealand produces a good amount of Syrah. Hawke's Bay obviously being one of the most famous regions for Syrah. I mean, and that ties in exactly with Sky's question here. So why is Kiwi Syrah so much more peppery than French Hermitage? It's a great question. And then Joe's touched on here. I'll answer these questions at the same time. I thought Syrah and Shiraz was the same thing. So technically, you are absolutely right. Shiraz and Syrah are genetically the same thing. The difference in naming these things, it's exactly the same as what we say for Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio. It's a stylistic difference. So it has to do with the climate and how it is produced. So in Australia, for example, Shiraz is what is grown. There are very, very few examples of Syrah. That is because the vast majority of climates within Australia would be classified as warm or hot climates. Yeah. Shiraz is a very, very flexible, adaptable grape variety, and it can be grown in a lot of different climates, and it grows very, very well across the majority of Australia. And in the warmer climates, it develops a lot of that peppery spice is less prevalent, and a lot more of the fruity characters come out.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially Shiraz is Australia, isn't it? It's Syrah in Syrah. It's called Syrah in the rest of the world. Certainly generally in the States, obviously in France they call it Syrah. Actually, that's not true. They will call it Shiraz sometimes, occasionally in South Africa, but there it's normally Syrah as well. So, same grape variety. And certainly when it's Syrah, it tends to be slightly lower in alcohol normally and higher on that, peppery, herbally, violety character rather than the deep, dark fruits of Barossa, which, as Mark was saying, is all about the fruit and full-bodied element and almost saltiness that comes with sort of Shiraz from Barossa, etc. and Hawke's Bay.
That bloody character.
Exactly, that bloody character. I am a huge fan of Hawke's Bay Syrah, I've got to say. I think they're absolutely gorgeous wines. And I love that peppery, cardamom-y character that you get from there. Question, I think someone asked, why is it more... why is Kiwi Syrah so much more peppery? Ooh, do you know what? That's a very tricky question to answer. I think it's almost like, why is Mourvèdre Sauvignon so much more aromatic and so much more gooseberry, passion fruity than others? There's a whole host of elements that go into it. Climate, yeast, the way it's harvested, all sorts of things. The peppery character, without going too geeky, comes from a compound called rotundone. And rotundone gives that clovey, peppery character. And for some reason, and I don't know why, I'm not a scientist, that's more prevalent in New Zealand and certainly in Hawke's Bay. Something to do with the soil, with the climate. I don't know the exact answer, but it's a certain element. Much as with Kiwi Sauvignon, it's other methoxypyrazines that are more prevalent from there.
So there are actually theories that are stating, and this is also under some serious, there's a lot of research going into it, let's say, that some people researchers believe that it has to do with the exposure to the sunshine within New Zealand. So of course there's a hole in the ozone layer above Australia, southern Australia and New Zealand. Excuse me. And that will mean that there's a lot more UV light on the vines, and people have a theory that increases that rotundone character within Hawke's Bay Syrah, which is it. And there's trials going on currently in the AWRI, the Australian Wine Research Institute, that are trying to kind of get to the bottom of why that rotundone character. And if you see here in the top right corner, that herbal floral, that green section, that is the summary of rotundone within that kind of green section there. So that green peppercorn, sage, eucalyptus. I get a lot of crossover between eucalyptus and rotundone, star anise, licorice, and then of course that black pepper is very, very clear.
That's really Hawke's Bay, isn't it? All of those things. And they're gorgeous wines. We need to do a Hawke's Bay tasting. That's what I want.
The honest truth is, Hawke's Bay, more and more, there are some producers there that have obviously spent a lot of time in the Rhone Valley, and they're picking up a lot. And some of those wines are just getting closer and closer and closer to Rhone Valley producers. They're just so elegant and pretty and just gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. So, those are our three wines for tonight. This is our kind of tour de France that we've gone through. Three very, very different regions, but three wines that we're very, very proud of. We're very happy to work with. And we would love to know if there's any questions that you have on any of these wines, on anything else that we're interested in. We'd love to hear your questions. If everyone coming off mute?
Yeah, David.
Well, I don't have a question, but I would say the red wine is my favourite of the three, and I'm not a big red wine drinker, but I have to say this is the nicest red wine I've ever drunk. I think you've converted me.
Fantastic.
Wow. That's cool. I think that's nice to hear. The good news is it won't break the bank. It's a decent price as well.
Yeah, very smooth. I like it.
Oh, great. That's nice to hear.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons we absolutely adore Leverson, the producer that works with us, is because they make these wines that are just like Bruno's wines, just like the rosé. They really are very, very easy to drink wines. They're not. There's enough there that you can really you can enjoy it and you can kind of talk about it like we are right now. But it's very much meant for everyday drinking. It's just
and I think
have it. Enjoy it.
It's juicy, isn't it? And actually, I love this Syrah wheel that we've got here. That you've done really well with that, Mark. And actually, if we're looking at this wheel, so if we're up in the herbal floral bit with Hawke's Bay, certainly with this wine, we're down in the black fruit character, aren't we? We've got that bramble, black fruit jam, black cherry. We just move around the wheel to black fruit, and that's where we are with this wine. It's warmer. down there. So you're going to get those darker fruit, richer flavors. And it's smooth, it's easy, but it's not complex, but it's not simple, if that makes sense. It's got enough to it for it to be, to have character, but, you don't need to think too much about it to enjoy it. I think, these guys are producing so much wine, and it's amazing that year on year they produce such good quality. Just, whatever the vintage be, a warm vintage, a cool vintage, they're always producing fantastic wines. And that's the mark of a good cooperative, to be able to do that.
Absolutely. So, okay, a couple more questions here. So yeah, totally fabulous Syrah, impressed at the office, and bottled pre-COVID. Very good. Yes.
Bottled pre-COVID, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, it was indeed.
Hey, I was just wanting to know, like the Syrah in Australia is quite like a punch in the face. So it's really strong.
Yep.
Why is that? Is it just because it's hot and it's concentrated?
It would definitely be those things. Absolutely, it would be the concentration and the increase. Honestly, the vast majority of that is the increase in alcohol. Truly, it's the increased sugar level which converts to alcohol. You're looking at, if you're talking about Barossa Shiraz or McLaren Vale Shiraz, you're talking about a kind of minimum of 14.5% alcohol. Whereas with these guys, with Le Versant, we're looking at 12.5 to 13. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, 2% difference, but that's a mid-strength beer right there. So it does make a big difference, and it makes a difference to the overall wine, to the overall power, and the way you taste wine. So it's just that extra volume and punch. It really does kind of, and the fruit that goes alongside that. And then of course, in Australia, they tend to add a lot of oak to that as well to kind of match that fruit. So it's kind of that extra little bit of power there. Does that make sense? Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Joe.
Cool. Any other questions?
So we're at just over an hour here now. So that's kind of everything we've need to talk about. So any other questions from anyone at all? Otherwise, we may let you enjoy your dinner.
Yeah, just Stu, question, do you have any more events coming up, or is this
We, in New Zealand or in Australia, we've got quite a few, yeah.
Okay, great.
New Zealand, I'm not sure. I'll have to pass over there.
NZ, we definitely have some more planned. It's just about whether or not we can get Alistair out of bed in the morning over in the UK. That's New Zealand time. It's the only thing, guys. But if you like the tastings, definitely let us know. We'd be keen to do these again. It's been really enjoyable from our end of the office here. And yeah, thanks all for coming.
Well, it's been great. Yeah, no, do you know, you can grab me out of bed. If we do Hawke's Bay Syrah, then you'll definitely get me out of bed.
Absolutely. So thanks, Gary. Exceptionally well. Thanks heaps, everyone. That's absolutely our pleasure, Gary. Thanks, Becky, for coming as well. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. We really hope you got a few things out of this. I know I definitely did. It's been great to see some people face to face. Been trapped in my house for a while now. Been great to see people. And thanks all for coming. Thank you, Alistair, for joining us.
Thanks, Alistair.
It was a struggle, 7:30 in the morning for you, but I'm sure you made it through, mate.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Alistair. Your comments were very interesting. Thank you.
Well, that's very kind, and enjoy easing of lockdown down there.
Oh, we're out. We're out of it.
We're out.
Oh, but don't. But enjoy.
Okay. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you all very much. I'm going to go and have some breakfast.
Nice
Breakfast time. Cheers.